I remember the exact moment it happened. My name is Michael Reynolds, and I'd been with Weston Logistics for 22 years. I had just walked into the conference room on that Thursday morning, coffee in hand, ready to discuss the upcoming client acquisition plan. I expected the usual mix of nods and questions, maybe some praise. I did not expect to be humiliated in front of every executive in the room. Jason, my VP, polished in his navy suit, standing at the head of the table with that rehearsed smile, looked at me like I was already obsolete. "We need fresh energy for this role," he said, pointing to a young, impeccably groomed analyst who had been with the company less than 3 years. "Emily will be leading the East Coast expansion starting next quarter." The words hit me like a gut punch. I could feel my stomach tighten. 22 years. I had built the operational frameworks that made expansions like this possible. I had trained teams, saved projects that teetered on the edge of disaster, and nurtured client relationships that kept our revenue steady through market crashes. And yet here I was passed over for someone far less experienced. The room was quiet. A few nods, some polite smiles, but nothing that reflected the depth of what had just happened. Jason moved on, elaborating on Emily's innovative approach and fresh ideas, completely ignoring my presence. It wasn't just a denial of a promotion. It was a public dismissal of my entire career. I felt a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. My mind raced, replaying every project, every late night, every client call that had cemented our company's reputation in the East Coast market. And now it was as if all of it meant nothing. My salary, my position, my decades of loyalty, they could be wiped away with a single sentence. I sat there, unmoving, letting the words sink in. I wanted to say something, to remind them that I had single-handedly salvaged the Larkspur contract last year, that I had personally handled the compliance fiasco that could have cost us millions. But I held my tongue. There was a cold clarity in me. This wasn't the time for an emotional outburst. This was the moment to observe, to calculate. When a meeting adjourned, I didn't storm out. I gathered my notes, quietly excused myself, and left the room with as much dignity as I could muster. As I walked down the hall, the weight of betrayal pressed down, but beneath it was a simmering awareness. I had power here, hidden power, and they had no idea how dependent the company was on me. That night, I sat at my desk long after everyone else had left, replaying the scene, going over client files, operational charts, and upcoming deadlines. I realized that while Jason may have controlled the promotion, I controlled the deal, the one that mattered most. And that was a realization that would change everything by morning. I think it's important to explain who I am and what I've built over these years, because without that context, my humiliation might seem exaggerated. My career at Weston Logistics didn't happen overnight. I started as a regional operations coordinator in my late 20s, and over the decades, I worked my way up, quietly mastering every system, every client, every workflow that kept the company functioning. I've been the guy who solved problems no one else could. When a Northeast distribution center was on the brink of missing its deadlines last year, I personally reorganized routes, retrained staff, and negotiated emergency contracts to prevent a massive delay. When an international client threatened to pull a $12 million contract over a paperwork error, I tracked the mistake, corrected it, and personally reassured the client, all before the morning coffee kicked in. Most of my contributions were invisible to executives, but every system, every success, every saved client relied on my work. I mentored dozens of employees, many of whom are now managers themselves. I built processes, wrote protocols, and even handled disputes that could have ended careers. I was the backbone of the operational side of the company. And yet, despite all of this, I was repeatedly overlooked when it came time for promotions. There was always someone younger, flashier, or better at schmoozing the board. Personally, the stakes were high. I'm married, 2 kids in college, and a mortgage that doesn't forgive mistakes. I've sacrificed weekends, vacations, and personal time to make sure that the company thrived. When I got passed over, it wasn't just ego. It was the real fear that my efforts, my life, my sacrifices were treated like they didn't matter. And that's what made Jason's dismissal so sharp. He had zero appreciation for the decades of work, for the loyalty, for the knowledge that ran through every corner of our operations. Emily, the young VP's protege, didn't know the first thing about the back-end systems, the client histories, or the fragile threads holding the expansion plan together. Yet she was suddenly elevated, celebrated, and positioned as the new star, while I sat there, quietly, watching it all unfold. But even in that moment, I understood something crucial. I wasn't powerless. I knew things about the company no one else did. I had relationships that mattered. I had knowledge that, if leveraged correctly, could turn the tables in hours. I could remain calm, I could stay professional, and I could plan. That quiet competence, the stuff that no one else could see, was my advantage. As I left my office that evening, I wasn't just angry. I was calculating. Every project, every client, every operational detail I had nurtured became a piece of a plan. Jason may have thought he had the upper hand, but in reality, he had just underestimated the very person who could make or break the deal he now thought he controlled. By the time I went home, I had already started sketching the moves I would make. This wasn't about revenge in a petty sense. It was about asserting reality. I knew my worth, and I knew that the company's most important deal was still firmly in my hands. That knowledge gave me focus, and focus gave me power. By the next morning, I had a clear view of why this had happened. The promotion wasn't about merit. It was about appearances, about who could charm the board during a quarterly meeting. Jason, polished and confident, knew how to talk the right language, show slides that looked impressive, and cite metrics that seemed meaningful. Real operational competence? That was invisible to them. I had seen this pattern before. A brilliant analyst in IT had suggested a process overhaul last year, only to have her idea credited to someone else. Another colleague, with years of client-facing experience, was passed over for a flashy MBA hire. The system rewarded those who knew how to sell themselves, not those who ensured the company actually functioned. I'd played by the rules, worked hard, and expected fairness. It was a miscalculation. As I sat at my desk reviewing the East Coast expansion files, I felt the frustration settle into a quiet determination. I could see the gaps in the company's processes, places where, without me, the system could falter. The executive team relied on my expertise, even if they refused to acknowledge it. I thought about the contracts I had negotiated personally, the client relationships I had nurtured for decades, and the operational safeguards I'd put in place. These were invisible threads holding the company together. Emotionally, I kept myself under control. There was no point in showing rage or panic. If I reacted visibly, Jason would think he had won. Instead, I documented my observations and mentally mapped out the leverage points I could use. Every system vulnerability, every client expectation, every procedural bottleneck became part of a larger picture that the executives hadn't even considered. The culture itself worked against people like me. The executives wanted quick wins and flashy reports. They didn't want to dig into the messy, essential work that kept operations running smoothly. They didn't value experience that wasn't immediately visible. And that made my next steps possible, because while they ignored me, I had all the tools I needed to influence the outcome from behind the scenes. Even now, I remember thinking, they think this promotion locks me out. They think I'm sidelined. They have no idea how much power I still hold. I wasn't bitter for the sake of being bitter. I was strategic. I understood the system, and I understood the people in it. And that understanding was about to become my advantage. By mid-morning, I realized that the critical East Coast client deal was in motion, and Emily, the newly promoted VP, was going to lead it. I had been part of this client relationship for over a decade. I knew the contacts, their expectations, their hidden concerns, details that weren't written in any report or visible in any dashboard. I knew exactly how to navigate the complexities that would arise. That realization was my turning point. I decided I wouldn't continue over-accommodating executives who undervalued me. No more preemptive approvals. No more stepping back quietly. I would act strategically, subtly leveraging my deep relationships and operational authority to ensure the company's success, and make it undeniable that Emily and Jason could not do it without me. I spent the next few hours mapping the deal in my mind. I listed the client's critical requirements, the potential operational risks, and the bottlenecks that could emerge. I thought about who on my team would need guidance and which systems might fail without oversight. Every detail, every past incident, every nuance became part of the plan. Emotionally, I was calm, almost detached, but my mind was calculating. The humiliation of the promotion faded into a focused clarity. I knew my patience and experience were assets they had underestimated. While they were focused on appearances and slides, I had real influence, the kind that directly affected outcomes. I made a quiet decision. I would intervene only when absolutely necessary. I wouldn't overstep or openly challenge the young VP. Instead, I would let the events unfold naturally, positioning myself as indispensable without making it obvious. This approach ensured that the executives would feel the consequences of their decisions organically, without me ever having to raise my voice or call out unfairness. I started by reviewing emails, operational schedules, and internal reports. I sent a few discreet messages to clients, maintaining normal communication, but subtly reinforcing that key decisions require my involvement. I could sense the tension building in the background, even if no one yet realized it. They assumed control. I held influence. By the end of the day, the turning point was clear. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was guiding events, shaping outcomes quietly, using my knowledge and relationships as leverage. The humiliation from the previous day had transformed into a strategic edge. I knew that by acting carefully, the payoff would be both satisfying and undeniable. Michael Reynolds might have been passed over, overlooked, and dismissed, but by the time the critical deal played out, he would be the one controlling its fate. And Jason, polished and arrogant, would learn exactly how much he had underestimated the man he thought he had sidelined. The next morning, I began putting my plan into motion. I reached out to key clients I had nurtured over the years, not with fanfare, but with careful professional check-ins. Each email, each call was designed to remind them of our shared history, the trust we had built, and the value of consistent execution. I didn't need to boast. I just needed to make sure they knew who was truly behind the reliability they depended on. At the same time, I reviewed internal operations. I had spent decades building these systems, and I knew exactly where the weak points were. A misrouted shipment here, a delayed approval there, small things that could cascade into visible problems if handled without care. I didn't create crises, but I quietly ensured that my guidance was needed for smooth execution. Every team member knew they could rely on me for clarity, and I made sure to maintain that presence without making it obvious to the executives. Throughout the day, I balanced appearances. I remained calm in meetings, compliant when Jason or Emily asked questions, and supportive in ways that seemed helpful but didn't reveal the full extent of my leverage. The executives believed I was just being professional, loyal, and cooperative. What they didn't realize was that every step I took increased my indispensability. I also started documenting everything, not for confrontation, not for complaint, but to have a clear record of my involvement and the dependencies built into the system. If any challenge arose, it would be impossible to ignore the truth. The company's success rested on my contributions. By the afternoon, subtle tension began to emerge. Clients called me directly with questions that Emily couldn't answer, or operations flagged issues that required my intervention. Each time, I stepped in just enough to keep things on track, never overstepping, but making it increasingly clear that without my guidance, the deal could falter. Internally, I noticed Jason growing anxious. His polished confidence wavered slightly when he realized that control was more complicated than it appeared. The executives were too focused on appearances, but I was quietly shaping reality. Every interaction, every email, every adjustment became a silent reminder. I was central to this operation. By the end of the day, the pieces were falling into place. I had created a network of influence that was invisible to anyone not paying attention, and yet unshakable. I was calm, patient, and methodical. My strategy was clear. Let the young VP lead publicly, but ensure that the company, the clients, and the critical systems all depended on my decisions. The humiliation of being passed over was no longer a wound. It had become the driving force behind my strategic leverage. The critical day arrived. The East Coast client meeting was set, and Emily, confident and polished, stepped in a lead. Jason hovered nearby, eager to assert his authority. From my position, I watched carefully, monitoring each interaction, each question, each subtle hesitation. I knew the client better than anyone, and it became immediately apparent that they expected the precision and insight I had consistently provided. Emily struggled to answer a few nuanced questions. Numbers she could read from reports, she could recite, but understanding the operational implications, the hidden risks, and the client's subtle expectations, that was beyond her. I stepped in sparingly, offering clarifications or suggesting small adjustments, framing them as supportive notes rather than corrections. Every time I spoke, the client nodded, reassured, and leaned on my input. Jason's unease grew. He had assumed that promoting Emily would ensure a smooth deal and visible control for him. Instead, the opposite was happening. Questions were deflected to me. Decisions were quietly routed through my experience. The executives began to realize, too late, that they had underestimated the depth of my knowledge and the subtlety of my influence. I felt a quiet satisfaction, calm but intense. I wasn't gloating. I was observing the consequences of a system that failed to recognize real competence. Emily still looked professional, still led the meeting publicly, but without me, critical gaps became apparent. The client's trust, built over years, subtly shifted toward the person who had maintained it all along me. Throughout the meeting, I guided the flow without overt interference. I suggested operational solutions in passing, flagged potential delays before they became problems, and offered context that only someone with my tenure would know. Each intervention was measured, deliberate, and designed to reinforce my indispensability without creating conflict. By mid-afternoon, it was undeniable. Jason's polished confidence was cracking. The board and senior executives were quietly observing, realizing that their assumptions about leadership and loyalty had been wrong. I could see the internal calculations happening. How had they ignored the person actually running the operations? How had they overlooked the one individual whose involvement ensured success? As the client signed off on key decisions, I remained composed, professional, and calm. Publicly, Emily had led the deal. Privately, the truth was obvious. Without me, it would not have succeeded. The room's energy shifted subtly. Respect replaced dismissal, and the executives could no longer ignore my hidden leverage. By the end of the day, the revelation was complete. My value was unmistakable. The humiliation of being passed over the previous week had transformed into undeniable authority. I had achieved a quiet reversal, one that Jason, Emily, and the board could all see without a single word of complaint from me. The power balance had shifted back in my favor, and the first hints of real consequences for their earlier misjudgment were now unfolding. The next morning, the atmosphere in the office was tense in a way that hadn't existed before. I walked in as usual, calm and composed, yet I could feel the subtle shifts around me. Jason's posture was tighter, his usually confident stride slower. He had spent the previous day trying to assert control over the deal he barely understood, and now the results of his oversight were beginning to ripple through the office. I could see it in the eyes of the executives, too. There was that quiet realization, the kind that comes when people recognize they misjudge someone essential. Emails I had sent or calls I had taken were now being acknowledged with a new level of attention. Questions that were previously brushed off were being directed to me, and suddenly, the executive team noticed just how central my knowledge and relationships had been. Clients began reaching out directly to me, not in a confrontational way, but in a tone of expectation. They needed guidance, clarification, and reassurance that the commitments made in the meeting were solid. I responded efficiently, calmly, and professionally, reinforcing the trust that had always existed between us. The executives could see this subtle shift, even if they didn't want to admit it yet. Jason, meanwhile, was struggling. Each misstep he had made the day before became clearer in hindsight. He attempted to cover, sending memos, scheduling additional meetings, and trying to assert authority, but the company's operations were already subtly dependent on my involvement. Every attempt he made to regain control only highlighted the gaps in his understanding, and the cracks in his confidence became impossible to ignore. In one particular board call, I quietly listened as Jason fumbled through operational updates. The board members, previously deferential to him, asked questions that only I could answer. I responded carefully, providing clarity and precision without showing irritation or superiority. The contrast between my calm expertise and his floundering became painfully evident. Each answer I gave reinforced the truth. The deal's success, and by extension, the company's reputation, depended on me. Meanwhile, Emily was visibly stressed. She had been promoted quickly, but the reality of leading without deep experience was sinking in. She looked to me for guidance more often than to Jason, and I provided it in small, measured doses. My interventions were strategic, not dramatic. I wanted the executives to see that the young VP's struggles weren't incompetence alone. They were a result of overvaluing presentation over substance. By midweek, the fallout became undeniable. The client subtly voiced concern about continuity and risk in front of the executives. "We trust the team, but we want to ensure our operational contacts remain consistent," they said, looking directly at me. The board exchanged glances, and I could feel Jason's panic escalating. He knew that his early dismissal of my capabilities had been a miscalculation, and there was no easy way to recover credibility. In quiet moments, I reflected on the satisfaction of watching fairness manifest without me needing to confront anyone directly. There was no need for dramatics or confrontation. The system's flaws, their favoritism, and their misjudgment had created the consequences themselves. I remained composed, professional, and in control, letting the natural flow of events expose their mistakes. As the days unfolded, the executives adjusted. They began deferring to me, consulting on operational decisions, and relying on my experience. Jason's earlier arrogance had eroded, replaced with cautious deference. Emily, still polished, adapted, but now she did so with humility, recognizing the value of experience over surface-level polish. By the end of the week, the entire office understood the new reality. I was not just a reliable operator. I was indispensable. The humiliation I had faced just days earlier had shifted into undeniable authority, and the executives were forced to acknowledge it without me ever raising my voice. The fallout had been total and inevitable, driven by competence, strategy, and the quiet patience of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. Finally, the deal closed successfully under my guidance. Everything went smoothly. The client was satisfied, and the executives had no choice but to recognize the truth I had carried with quiet confidence all along. There were no grand announcements, no confrontation in the boardroom, just a steady acknowledgement from the CEO and the board that their earlier oversight had been a mistake. I remember the CEO's glance, subtle but unmistakable, as if he had finally connected the dots. He didn't need words to convey it. I had always been the anchor of these operations, the stabilizing force that ensured promises made in the boardroom translated into real results on the ground. My value, previously ignored, was now obvious to everyone who mattered. Jason, once so polished and confident, now moved with caution. His early arrogance had been exposed not through personal attacks or drama, but through the undeniable reality of operational dependence. Every decision, every oversight, and every client expectation highlighted the necessity of my involvement. He understood, without needing to be told, that his promotion of Emily over me had been a strategic error. Emily, too, had learned a quiet lesson. She approached me with a newfound respect, consulting more often, listening more closely, and recognizing that leadership was not about titles or visibility. It was about competence, consistency, and the ability to navigate complex systems with skill. Our relationship remained professional, yet balanced with a mutual acknowledgement of what had been proven in practice. I reflected on the weeks leading up to this moment, the humiliation, the frustration, the sense of being undervalued. All of it had fueled a deliberate strategy. I had stayed calm, leveraged my knowledge, and positioned myself subtly, but undeniably, as indispensable. And in doing so, I had reclaimed authority without theatrics, proving that patience, competence, and quiet persistence were more powerful than anger or confrontation. In the end, the recognition came quietly but firmly. I received personal notes from clients, acknowledgement from board members, and, most importantly, the respect of peers who had witnessed the unfolding events. I didn't need to demand it. The results themselves spoke louder than any complaint or self-promotion could have. I also felt a personal sense of closure. My integrity had remained intact. My family security, the mortgage, my child's college plans, all of the practical stakes I had carried through this ordeal were safeguarded thanks to the calm and calculated way I had handled the situation. I hadn't just protected my career, I had reinforced my identity and worth in a system that had initially overlooked it. Walking through the office after the deal closed, I could feel a quiet shift in energy. People treated me differently, not with overt awe, but with recognition and subtle deference. I was finally operating from a position of unshakable credibility. My manager's earlier dismissal was now a distant memory, replaced by tangible acknowledgement of my value. I knew that real authority wasn't about titles or appearances. It was about competence, loyalty, and the consistent application of skill over time. I had been underestimated, bypassed, and overlooked, but the results had spoken for themselves. By morning, after careful strategy and quiet leverage, I controlled the deal, reclaimed my influence, and ensured that fairness, practical, operational, undeniable fairness, prevailed. As I closed my laptop that evening, I felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Not vindictive satisfaction, but a deep, composed relief. The system had corrected itself, and I had done nothing more than remain competent, patient, and strategically decisive. The respect, recognition, and authority I had earned were lasting, and they were earned the only way that truly matters, through skill, experience, and the quiet power of being indispensable.